Lift every voice and sing
till earth and heaven ring.
Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the roaring sea. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty.
Lift every voice and sing. Another beautiful version of the Black National Anthem, as it is called, that was performed by the Stanford Talisman Virtual Choirs. We're really happy and grateful to have you here today. And today's talk is called How Did We Get Here? Systems of Race. That is a very good question, which leads to another question. Where exactly is here? Here is this time in history when a bill to make animal cruelty a federal crime is unanimously passed, and yet lynching is still not a crime. Lynching is killing a human being without a trial merely because you have some accusation. And the bill to make this barbaric has failed to pass the U.S. House for over 120 years. And only in 2018 did it pass the Senate. Here. How did we get here? And the simple answer to that question is systems of race that are woven into the structure of our society, and in the case of America, those are systems that are an integral part of the foundation on which the entire nation is built. And the systems of race are designed to do a few things: dehumanize, to disempower, to disenfranchise, and by demoralizing, by dehumanizing, by disempowering, disenfranchising, meaning taking away people's ability to vote, to be active in the systems of political systems of society, will make it easier to justify the injustices. If you dehumanize, well, that makes it easier to justify all the things that we're doing wrong. And if we disenfranchise, we make it much harder for the people who are oppressed to do anything about it. And if you're demoralized anyway, it's all connected. You can't break free from the impact. So while we're focusing on America, because of the protests that were catalyzed by the death of George Floyd, it's very clear that these systems exist with the same purpose in most countries and in every place that was touched by the transatlantic slave trade and by colonization. So today we have over 400 years of history to get through, and we've got about 40 minutes. So, did everyone bring a lunch? We're going to touch on some of the historical events in the timeline in 4 parts: the slavery era in America, the Reconstruction and Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights era, and the post-Civil Rights era. Now, these are huge chunks of time, so we're going to just touch on a few things. And the reason that we have these conversations is to spark further conversations. That's all we can do in the time that we have. So So as we go through those things, I encourage you to think about, try to make connections with the past to what you are seeing that's happening today. I'd like for you to meet Matilda McCreer. She was the last known survivor from the last slave ship, the Clotilda, which arrived in the U.S. in the late summer of 1860. Anyone who is over 80, anyone who is over 80 could have still met Matilda McCreer because she died at the age of 82 years old in 1940. That's also the same year that John Lewis was born. And some people say slavery was such a long time ago, it's not even relevant. I disagree. So we're moving right along. We're already at 1787, and that's when the U.S. Constitution was written during what is now called the Constitutional Convention. Black people were not part of that mix. So sometimes people say that the Constitution was written for all men. If we pay attention, we'll know that that is definitely not the case. So black people weren't part of that as the foundations of America were being solidified. How do we know? Less than a year later, Thomas Jefferson, who's one of the founding fathers, who wrote the Constitution, also the third president, he wrote a paper. And in that paper, he asserted that blacks were inferior to whites, especially in intellectual and emotional capability. He wrote that they were much more animalistic. Remember our words. They were much more animalistic. They suffered less from pain and trauma. He asserted that, of course, whites were more sensitive because of their higher development. And it was writings like this from men in power that fostered this faulty reasoning to justify the laws that were being implemented to protect slavery. In 1790, Congress denies citizenship. There will be no naturalization for anyone who is not free white, and that continues to expand across into the Southwest and continue expanding. Here, 70 years later, we come to Dred Scott versus slavery. Anybody heard of that? Dred Scott? Yeah. So what that did was to deny all slaves, all ex-slaves, and descendants of slaves the rights to citizenship. And it also denies the right to prohibit slavery. So there's no right to prohibit slavery. And this continues. The Civil War begins, things continue, and now we come to 1863, where Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, bringing all the slaves. April 1865, the South surrenders and the Civil War ends. And the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolishes slavery throughout the country. And now we're already at the immediate post-slavery era, which is the Reconstruction era and the Jim Crow era. So in the beginning, there were massive efforts to keep black people from having the same rights as white people. And one thing that was created was black codes. And what black codes did is they created a whole new set of rules for what black people can and can't do. Here we are now at the Jim Crow era, and all of these laws were enforced, including the racial segregation, especially primarily in the American South. And this is when, in 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was okay. They just basically ignored the evidence that the separate but equal always meant the facilities that were meant for black people were indeed inferior to the ones that white people were given access to. This went from everything from schools, transportation, every form of public life. If it was separate, it was a lot of things. Equal was not one of them. And by now, although the Constitution forbade outright racial discrimination, every state of the former Confederacy moved to take away more rights of African Americans. They imposed, to keep them from voting, they imposed things like reading requirements. Now remember, people were forbidden to read just before slavery had ended. So you're not going to magically be able to read. Okay, moving right along. We are now at the civil rights era, moving right along. So these were major pieces of legislation that ended legal segregation. And there was also, it was legally forbidden then to discriminate in renting and buying housing. However, the system was very clever because for every advancement, there were new sets of rules. There were that were applied with discernment. Loans, there were different requirements for blacks than there were for whites. And then we're going to, the post-civil rights era going forward after 1968, people said, well, you know, there's no more discrimination, there's no more racism. Whew, glad that's behind us. Actually, you know, there were new initiatives in the 80s. There was the war on drugs, and all of these things were, in effect, a long-running war on black people. So, an example, during the time when there was a crack epidemic in the 80s, that's when people began to crack down on drug offenses. And black people were not treated for an addiction. They were criminalized, they were put in jail, and they were often charged with felony crimes. This is important. Why a felony crime? Because you lose a lot of rights when you commit a felony crime. So same types of crimes were committed by whites or blacks. Blacks were often sentenced to felonies. The felony conviction, what does it mean? A permanent criminal record? In most cases, unless you can afford the expenses to try to get your record cleared, losing the right to vote, losing the right to receive public assistance, so food stamps, things like that. Assistance to get higher education. So even if you put that behind you and decide, hey, I'm going to go to get my act together, I'm going to get an education, go to college, you're not going to get the assistance for that. There's a long list of jobs that you wouldn't suspect that you are also then ineligible for that include things like a convicted felon not being able to become a barber or a beautician. Now, 2017, the opioid crisis was declared. The opioid crisis is that for a period of time, people were being given prescription drugs and opioids, and they became addicted to them. And in the course of that, a lot of people became addicted to them, not just the people for whom they were prescribed, and the people that are the large portion, that's more of a white law. So what happened? It was declared a public health crisis, and a 5-point plan was enacted, even though people who are suffering from these addictions are buying, some of them buying illegal drugs, they're engaging in illegal activity to get these drugs. It's a health crisis. That's the difference. So with that, we are coming to, that was an overview of how the system of race has brought us from kidnapping black people from their beds to the point of watching black people have their lives snuffed out in front of our eyes and everything in between. And still that struggle for justice, for equity, for freedom continues. And in a moment, I'd like to open up a discussion and look at what we're seeing today and see which parallels you see to the original goal of the system of race. What was that goal? To create opportunity and wealth for a large part of the American people at the expense or detriment of another. And someone said, well, that wasn't the goal, to hurt to hurt the black people. That's the effect, and nothing is done to stop that. So those black people's lives are simply collateral damage.
Lift every voice.